Welcome to episode 2 of LCKast, your LCK podcast. Ooh, the pun. And I'm joined by the lovely, the one and only, the amazing Emily Rand, League of Emily, who is the expert on LCK, of course, because she is an expert on every single league out there, including
I'm not.
Sleep 6 hours a day to catch up with every single league matches out there, including probably LJL, because we were just talking about how she watched LJL as that league debuted blank, the former SKT player.
I did. I watched Blank's debut. They won. It was interesting. It was entertaining. I'll say that.
It was entertaining. The subject of this episode, in fact, is about playstyles, and to give a bit of backdrop, ever since SKT came, their journey at the MSI ended at semifinals at the MSI, and G2 eventually won the title, and then the summer split of LCK kicked off. The biggest subject in the LCK community, the Korean community, as well as Reddit, which is the English community, has LCK got its playstyle right? So LCK has always been known for the slow, methodical, vision-based, macro-focused playstyle, and the big question mark that was on top of everyone's head was, have we got the playstyle wrong all the time? And that question mark was still there as we headed into the summer split. And now the question is it a coincidence that all the teams that are performing well so far or exceeded expectations, such as Kingzone, Afreeca, and Sandbox, are leaning towards the early game aggression? And I might start with that question, in fact. Emily, what do you think about that? What do you think about...
I mean, so if you're saying, like, I think it's a bit specious to say, like, have we gotten the playstyle wrong this entire time? Because obviously not. Like, and there are several international championships that say otherwise. One thing I do think, though, that is, and I'm going to bring this up again and again, especially when we talk about Afreeca and Kingzone, is that I do feel that, especially in the current meta right now, there are a variety of different ways that you can play. Obviously, when we look at G2, we look at the strength of their solo laners, right? And that's really where they excelled, starting at the World Championship, but then continuing through the mid-season invitational. And it's what makes them, in my opinion, the best team in the world right now. Because with this new roster, they understand exactly how they want to play and how they can make the most of their solo laners and how they can basically triple flex between all three lanes.
Yeah.
In terms of, just what I want to play, they can triple flex so many different champions.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I think that because South Korea had such a definitive way that they wanted to play and that the game could be played for so long, and they did come up with some of the best ways to attack certain metas, especially I would say like season 3 through season 6, 7.
You're talking about the period when LCK was dominant, season 3 to season 7.
Exactly.
That's pretty much it. Those are the seasons that LCK won the world. Coincidentally.
I think that what happened last year is it's not just an opening up of new champions in the bot lane. It's not just the eradication of Tracker's Knife, which I think people over-focus on vision placement with that, by the way, just as a side tangent. I think they over-focus on, like, the amount of wards that are being placed because people are like, well, it's pretty much the same amount of wards, like, not really that big of a vision shift. But it does matter who's placing them and what that communication looks like early in the game. It affects early jungle pathing when, the jungler isn't placing wards through Tracker's Knife, and they're having to communicate with the support, and the support is having to take more of that in addition to laning, etc. That's my tangent on Tracker's Knife. But I think that now that the meta is so open, there are a bunch of different ways that you can play the game right now. And I don't think there is one specific correct way to play. So if you try to play like G2, for example, and you don't have the same flexibility and strength of players, you're not going to be able to pull off the flexibility, like that kind of triple flex that I talked about, right? That they do so well. You're just not going to be able to do it. And I think that the teams that are succeeding in Korea right now, you mentioned Kingzone, you mentioned Afreeca. I think these
Sandbox.
are two teams that have, and Sandbox. And Sandbox did this last split too, actually. Like, even though I ragged on Sandbox a lot, and I didn't think that they were like super good, I thought where they were in the standings was actually a bit of an indictment on how Korean teams were struggling to adjust. But I do think that Sandbox knows what they want to do, right? Like, you've done interviews with Joker before where he's talked about this several times in terms of how they bring the team together and how they just try to play what's best for them. And I think that's been really difficult for South Korean teams to wrap their head around, that there's not like, you need to play the game this way, and this is default the best way to play, and we have a team in Korea that plays the best this way, so we're going to go off of that play style ourselves instead of looking at the talent that we have and trying to focus on how we can flex around the meta. So I think that's my main thing about play styles in Korea right now, is that the teams that are succeeding have found a way that they want to play and they want to draft around their players. And it might not always make the most sense on paper. You might look at their drafts and be like, this is insane. I know that certain people have, and sometimes I would agree with them, to be honest. Like, on paper, not the best decision. But since it's working out for how they want to play with the specific talent they have, I think that's the biggest hurdle for teams like, for example, SKT, KT to some extent, but their communication just seems to be wonky anyway. But some of the teams that we look at that are struggling, I think, need to refocus on what their players are really good at and try to draft around them and play to that style.
So, I actually asked it, like, on retrospective, this is super interesting. So for those of you guys who don't know, I do like a series of in-depth interviews with the players, which I really enjoy. Like, of course I also do post-match interviews, but when you do post-match interviews, you only focus on the match result, which, can be interesting, but they don't age that well. And also, because the player is focused on what just happened, you can't really have like an in-depth conversation with them. And I really enjoy doing like an in-depth conversation outside the context of matches, just sitting down with them for a coffee for 30 minutes and just having a chat. And I did an interview with 3 players, like 3 in-depth interviews before the start of the summer split. That was with Keen, Viper, and Joker. And it's quite interesting that Keen was surprisingly, because you know how when we don't think of Keen, he's like really introverted. Like, he doesn't speak about his like ideas, like, or thoughts that much. But for Keen, he was very negative about the current state of the LCK playstyle. He's like, hey, we already failed. He used the word failed at MSI, so maybe it's time for teams to change their playstyles up. And that's quite interesting that he was in that mindset in the retrospective of now, where Afreeca completely seemed to change up their playstyle between spring and summer split. Maybe they try to do this all the time, but they didn't manage to execute it. But that's quite interesting. And when I posed a similar question to Viper, even though he did admit that the meta is awarding early game aggression, fast-paced skirmishes, he thinks that there is no one way of winning a game, that there are multiple different ways to do this right now, and the LCK way of winning might have its own merits. When I say LCK, like the slow, sure way of, like, slowly dominating the map and eating the team away. So, Okay, so Viper said that there are multiple ways of winning, and LCK is not necessarily the wrong way of doing it, and because SKT did not perform at MSI, it just seems that way. There was Viper and Joker was like, yeah, hey, like, you know, those new picks are cool, like we're seeing new things on Scrim. That's pretty positive. He was like, just like really open to new things and coming in, and he was pretty excited about everything. So it's quite interesting how each player reacted to the question, what do you think about the new meta, reflects how their respective teams are playing in terms of their playstyle at the summer split. I don't know, that was my observation.
I think it's interesting who said what from what team, because
Yeah.
like I brought up Joker in terms of the fact that not only in that interview, but in interviews he did with him in spring, he really talked about like trying to that.
Well, you sound a
Viper. No.
Okay.
No.
I can still hear you.
All right.
Okay.
And then Viper, like so even when Griffin were doing really well, I criticized them for not being as proactive as they could early. And you saw this when they did try to do, like, I know everyone ripped them apart for the Talia Pantheon lane. I don't think game one was particularly egregious, but when they failed to execute it in game one, they should not have played it in game three of the finals. That's so just so people know where my opinion is at on that. I think Griffin have struggled with trying to be proactive early, so it makes sense that they would want to say that you can run this specific playstyle and still be successful. And I do think to some extent you can, but I also think that, so for example, they played Sona Galio, right? Against Sandbox in their third game.
In the first game they played Sona Tarek, in the third game they played Sona Galio.
Yeah. I'm thinking of the Galio one just because of the Draven Tom Kench. Because there are ways to... So first of all, nothing beats Sona late right now. She's insane. But there are ways to counter it early if you are aggressive enough. And Sandbox is a team that is actually aggressive enough early. So it's not that you can't play like a slow scaling play style necessarily, but I do think that if you are drafting for that, you have to be aware that it's going to, like, the other team can respond. And because there are so many ways to play, because you are rewarded for early proactivity, that it's no longer a guarantee that you can do what SKT does and seed a bunch of early advantages and come back late.
So you
which I'm pointing out SKT because that was like their default playstyle for so long.
Yeah. So you wouldn't necessarily say go to an extreme that, hey, early game aggression is the only way to win the game. However, it's more to do with it almost seems to be two things. Number one, as a team, you need to be comfortable in your own playstyle, no matter which playstyle you choose. And the second thing is, playstyles are paper, scissors, rock. You just mentioned Sona, and Sona is a perfect example. Like, Sona is such a flip coin. Like, you know, you can completely destroy when the opponent picks Sona, or like you can carry at Sona, and Sona, like the way whether Sona succeeds depends on how the opponent team reacts to it. If you did what Sandbox did and completely kill Sona lane early game and don't even allow it to go to end game, then the Sona just doesn't work out. So it's a paper, scissors, rock. It's not only about, hey, like, you know, we're gonna play a late game comp or we're gonna play an early game comp, but it's also about, hey, they're gonna play a specific type of play style, so we need to react to it. Being able to react is, I think, is a second key to success at the moment.
Yeah, I think, see, like, Sona is so strong. I did want to bring up because she's even been played in the LPL now. And like previously she was not, because as you saw from IG, SKT, say what you want about IG's propensity to shoot themselves in the foot repeatedly, that game against SKT was it's not that IG were like way ahead in terms of like they are such a better team that they stomped them in record time. It was a massive compositional mismatch, and what happened there is what I had suspected would happen when Sona was played in LPL. And because they just locked in Draven and dove it over and over again, right? And I think it also has to do with one of the reasons why we've seen some of the LCK teams be able to get away with it until now is because there weren't LCK teams that were willing to play super aggressive early. But now we have Sandbox, we have whatever Afreeca are doing. And then to some extent we also actually have Kingzone, arguably, because they've also played some more like scaling comps as well. But I think the two you have to watch out for are definitely Sandbox and Afreeca. And if you're going up against one of those teams, you do have to be aware that they will dive you early over and over again.
So going back to that analogy of paper, scissors, stone. Yes, okay, Griffin tried Sona, but for the first time against Sandbox, it didn't work out at all. Okay, actually, it did work out, and then Griffin decided to throw that. But they tried it on game 3 again, and they got completely countered by a Draven pick, which is a pick that Ghost likes. And Griffin has tried Sona pick again against Hana Life Esports. However, I don't necessarily take that as like a redemption, because it wasn't necessarily to do with Griffin executing it extremely well. It was more to do with Hana Life Esports not countering that well enough.
Yeah. And I don't think Hana Life have been particularly consistent or like strong. I'm actually kind of sad because previously Hanwha Life was a team that I really cited as a team that knew like how they wanted to play around their players last year, and that was part of their success. And I think they've definitely lost that this split specifically, but starting last split as well.
I think this is my opinion. I think drafting stage has become too diverse for Hanwha to cope with, because I never believed
actually that's a really good point.
Because right now, like, there are more champions than ever being viable for drafting stage, and even though Hana Life knew exactly what they wanted to do, it didn't mean that they had like a diverse options of what they could execute, which are two slightly different things.
They don't.
Okay, they don't. Okay, you can be more direct. I'm just, and because there are so many diverse.
Sorry, Hana Life. I was rooting for you, but yeah.
Yeah, but there are so many diverse ways to play right now that Hana just doesn't seem to know how to deal with all of that. And going back to the Sona bot, like, yeah, Griffin plays Sona. Hana could have countered it with like clicking a very strong lane pick, such as Draven, which is what Sandbox did and succeeded. But Hana just didn't know what to do with it, and they just let the lane go into an equal mid game. And if you let a game go even with Sona on the other side, no, that game is dead. You're so dead.
Yeah, you're done. You're done. She's insane.
Before we get into like specific games, is there anything else you want to add in terms of playstyle trends in LCK? Are we seeing any major?
No, I think that's it. I think I cited the teams that I wanted to cite, basically Kingzone and Afreeca.
Yeah.
And Sandbox.
And Sandbox. Because I wanted to go straight into Kingzone, who is... Many people might be surprised that Kingzone Dragon Ace is actually in the first of rankings for LCK, because when Pawn announced that he is sick again, poor kid... he has
a back injury. Like it's never getting better, and it sucks. Like I feel I feel super bad.
I do
for
feel really
that
bad
because
too.
it's shitty, right? Like he
Mm,
can't practice a certain amount of times. Like it sucks. It
yeah,
just sucks all around.
yeah. And like I was also quite disappointed because Pawn was flying around the rift in the spring split. Like his Corki
Doing
was
pawn things.
amazing. I think Pawn it was back. It was back to 2014. He was Baker versus Pawn, and I was like, wow, like the rivalry continues after all these years. And then Pawn announced at the beginning of summer split that he's taking a hiatus. I'm like, no. And then everyone was like questioning, hey, can Nathan step up? Because previously we only saw him play like support picks such as Lulu, but this is not the Nahan we expected. He's doing super well. And
Yeah, he's a lot more flexible. Like so Nahun became kind of a meme in the West just because of his inauspicious debut, we'll put it that way. But I don't think that was necessarily his fault. It was just kind of a weird situation. However, I didn't think that he was I didn't think he was as bad as people had built him up to be, but I also didn't think he was particularly flexible, as you pointed out. So the real revelation for Nahyun has been him pulling out things like the Nico, for example. That was something that I kind of didn't see him necessarily performing super well on.
he played Camille mid.
Yeah, I mean that was an interesting. he's going to become the next Doinby in a bit, you know. He'll be.
But they have an opposite character. Doinby is this cocky, He's like he raises his arm and screams, and then he's like the sweetest little boy. He hates blaming other players, in like press conference interviews. Like all the other players in Kingdom tells me, oh, Nathan is such a good influence to everyone because he's got such a sweet vibe and he makes everyone happy around him. So in terms of personality, I feel that Nathan is a bit opposite to Doinby, but.
Oh, I'm sure. I was just talking about the weird mid lane picks. He needs to pick like Nautilus next. But no, I think Nathan obviously has a different role than Deft, right? Because you talked about Deft zooming around the map, and the thing that not Deft. Oh my God, Pawn. Sorry, I'm still waking up. Pawn was always really good at drawing pressure. Like throughout his career, even he would lock in something like, for example, in season 5, I believe season 5, there's this TF game where he was on EDG and he fed 5 kills in the first 10 minutes, but he was still roaming around the map, so they had to deal with him. And he was always really good at drawing pressure away from his team, and that's not what we see from Nahyun. But I think Kingzone have a few more options now than we're gonna pour everything into Deft and have him carry us late, which is really good for the team. And I think they have a pretty good understanding of what they want to do, and also when they want Deft to run those Morgana lanes, right? Because we've seen him play the Morgana. He did lose on the Sona, but we've seen him play a lot more than your standard scaling hyper carries, which is more what he was on last split. He did the lethality Varus to Snowball, I think was kind of the thing that people pointed out was a very Deft thing last split. And I just like that Kingzone have more options now. Yeah. And it feels like they're a more complete team, which is good because you can't, as we kind of pointed out with ragging on Hanwha Life a bit, if you only have one very specific way that you can play, and I'm not talking about style, I'm talking about actual gold distribution and champion selection. If you have a very narrow way to play, there are now teams that will punish you for that. So it's cool to see that Kingzone came from having this more narrow focus now in summer being a bit more flexible.
in a lesser extent, I'm also tempted to drag SKT into that equation when you talk about having a narrow way of winning, but I'll get into SKT
They
later.
don't have to though. It's so oh god, that could throw things talking about SKT.
I know exactly where Clid is gonna go on the best level 6, but that's the amazing thing about Kingzone. And Kingzone has been being compared to G2 a lot by the Korean casters, and I think one thing that Kingzone has similar to G2 is everyone has super large champion pool. I mentioned this on the stream with Raz, but they call Rascal the trash cleaner or the trash can, because Kingzone has a habit of drafting a champion because, oh, we need to take the champion away, and then later deciding, okay, we don't have anyone else to play this champion, so we'll just throw it to Rascal and he will handle it.
Yeah, we're just kind of stuck with this in draft, yeah.
But he can play any champion, like, well, not any champion. We haven't seen him play, I don't know, Mordekaiser, like, just yet, but like Rascal has...
It's coming.
It's coming soon, it's coming soon. Like, I have my soft bets on Kingzone being the first team to play Mordekaiser, because I also remember Deft really liked Mordekaiser before he got reworked, but...
Deft loved the Mordekaiser.
Oh, he loved it.
Oh my gosh. Like, we needed to take that away from him.
He's like, yo, you're not a Pokemon trainer. You can't run around with the dragon.
He had way too much fun microing that dragon. Like,
oh, man.
I'm sorry, Def. Like, you should not have been playing Mordekaiser.
He was enjoying it too much, but oh my! Every time. But Rascal has a large champion pool. Cause we always knew him as like a super aggressive, like, jungler. Like, he is currently at second place in the Korean solo queue after Tarzan. But he can play Sejuani, he can play like Javan, he can go super aggressive, but he's also known for his Jax, which is very passive pre-level 6 game. So Kaz has last champion.
He's also played the Karthus too.
Oh yeah, that's it.
He's also played the Karthus too.
Which is like a symbol
Which is another, like, yeah, you need to farm up.
Which is like the symbol of Yankos, and also like the defining champion for any off-meta playing jungler. And we already mentioned that Naihan has a very large champion pool. Deft, even though everyone by default remembers Deft with his Tristana, he's like crit-based champions, like he is not only capable of, but is ready to play Victor, Sona, Morgana. So because every single player in that team has such a large champion pool, it's really difficult to ban out, and they can easily flex into any kind of win condition based on how the opponent team decides to draft. They're like, okay, we'll go early game, we'll go late game, or we'll let the top carry, we'll let the bot carry. So it's really difficult for the enemy team to predict, which is especially working out in LCK, where the paper scissors rock with playstyle is quite rigid.
I think for me, the surprise has been Cuz. And I'm still kind of like shaky on him in terms of his some of his early jungle pathing, because I do think he leaves himself open sometimes in a ways that we saw were more egregious in past metas, especially when he would like lock in the Zac or something and then just get kind of destroyed early. But I do think that he has been more flexible and performed better than I expected, just as someone who was kind of down on him as one of these players that I looked at, and I was like, I don't see a lot of flexibility there. As you pointed out, he's played a variety of different jungle picks that flex into a variety of different styles, and that's been really nice to see from him, especially since when he first came into the league, he was this like super hyped up solo queue player, right? And then he ended up being one of the weaker players on that initial lineup, to the point where I know people were quite critical of him during those first like Longzhu failures, I guess. But that's been if there's like one player I wanted to point out on this team. And I know I like look at junglers too frequently, so it could be that as well. But I do think that Cuz has exceeded my expectations, and his kind of newfound flexibility is one of the things that makes this team work.
I always rated Cuz pretty high. And going back to the whole bet with Thorin, where I won the ticket to Worlds because a lot of people predicted that Kingzone is not going to make it to playoffs, but somehow the bait, and one of the bait came from Cuz. I don't know. Somehow, I know that he has a high mechanical ceiling. That was always been the case during the Longju times, and even though he has not performed as well on tanks, for me it wasn't as salvageable as some of the other super aggressive junglers I've seen, such as like Malang or, oh my god, I feel really bad mentioning Peanut now. Even though Cuz because a jungler needs to serve such a variety of roles, it is usually the case that if they're really good at rotating around the map, sometimes they're not as good at playing like hyper carry, level 2 gank junglers. But Cuz seemed to have some flexibility even when he was quite young. A lot of people don't remember that he was quite young during the Longju gaming, and I simply think he has matured a bit. He always had the mechanical ceiling. He just needed
fair.
to.
He was what? He was 17, right? Like he entered the league as soon as he turned 17.
He entered the league at 17, so he was quite young. So, and I just think that he has a lot more to show, which is pretty cool. Like, this is one player that I see is keep growing. But what do you think about the comparison between Kingzone and G2? What do you think about that narrative in particular?
I think it's probably due to their drafting. Kingzone's drafting, rather, because they've showed a lot of similar picks and tried to flex their solo lanes similarly. As we spoke to before, or just looking at the list, right, of solo laners that they've picked, you have Jace, Silas, Nico, Aurelia, as we talked about, the Camille and the Ryze flex, Camille, Nico flex, almost all of these besides Azir, literally just Azir for Nahyun mid and Clid top, which Clid has also been played mid in LPL. If you look at their solo lanes, they're completely interchangeable, right? So, and then you have Deft really opening up, again, Deft has been known for his hyper carries, but even when he was on EDG, and I'm not saying these games were good, by the way, they were not good. He played TP Jace bot a few times. I think as a player, he seems to have always been willing to play different things. Whether that has worked out for him is a different story. But in terms of, we mentioned the Mordekaiser, right? He has always seemed like the type of player who has been willing to branch out. And so with practice, that kind of flexibility would hopefully come for him, despite the fact that he's always going to be known for playing strong, typical AD champions in the bot lane. It seems like if you look at his history, it seems like maybe we haven't given him as much credit as is due for his, at least the will to be more flexible. Whether the execution was good is up in the air until recently, I think. And even then, sometimes you see him move slightly differently than you would. I think his Morgana is really interesting to watch, actually, because you can see the push and pull between his positioning and where he wants to be as an AD carry versus where he needs to be to hit the Morgana bindings. But I think that is the most interesting thing about Deft, and another reason why I think people would be comparing them to G2, because one of G2's greatest strengths, or their greatest strength, is their flexibility. And the fact that Perks is not initially an AD carry, he's still learning the AD carry position, he obviously knows how to play mages incredibly well, and that has served them really well in a meta where you can pick a large variety of things. I wouldn't say that they're nearly as flexible as G2's. And I also, there is you pointed out Rascal, someone who kind of becomes the dumping ground for like the flex champion, or like the OP champion that they want to kind of take away. I still think Rascal needs some work in order to be as strong of a, like, in order to be that kind of reliable player that Wonder is for G2. Because if you think about Wonder and his role with G2 historically, there were games, like especially during play-ins last Worlds, where it would be Wonder kind of like almost single-handedly like picking up the team and like pushing them through, right? And I don't see Rascal being that. Like when I think of who's going to do that on this team, I still think of Deft first. So I think in order to be as strong as G2, you need to be able to rely on like Nahun and Rascal and Deft all as triple carry threats. I think they're getting there though. I can see the comparison just based on drafting styles as well.
By the way, can you hear the rain?
I cannot. I've heard cars.
Okay, so it's quiet. It started. By the way, guys, I'm streaming at the attic of my place because I do not want to wake up my neighbors at 2 a.m. and
sorry.
It's okay. It's quite warm in Korea actually, so that's pretty good. Okay, cool. One final question about Kingzone. Is this definitely a team that is just going to Worlds? Is this do they deserve the title of the strongest team in the LCK at the moment?
I think they are, because so right now in terms of who looks the strongest in LCK, I think it's Kingzone, and then I also think it's Afreeca who beat Kingzone. But Afreeca is a lot more volatile, even with their win. I think Kingzone is in a good position because looking at the standings, they have 50 championship points from last season. And they also, I mean, it's unfortunate because the Kingzone SKT series was better than the Griffin SKT series. And I think a lot of people kind of keep that in mind. But it doesn't really matter because they only have 50 points. I do think that puts them in a really good position to make Worlds, though. So when you're looking at some of these other teams trying to make a run, like for example, Afreeca, if they continue performing at a high level and like only improve, they're going to be a dark horse to come out of the bracket, if not like try to make a run at the title. But in terms of championship points, they're in a really bad position. And Kingzone are in a really good position. So I'd actually be pretty surprised if they dropped off so hard that they didn't make it, simply based on like the fact that they're mathematically in a pretty strong position.
Like, I think that's a good cue to talk about a team that does not have any circuit points and need to work very hard to go to Worlds, but surprised all of us, including Emily, and the team that just defeated Kingzone Dragon, and that is Afreeca Freecs. And in the pre-stream note that I wrote with Emily, I just wrote about 2 or 3 lines of like a short summary of each team. And for Afreeca Freecs, I wrote, what the fuck were they feeding those kids? Because there is Afreeca during Springs who were kind of trying to play aggressive but didn't know what the hell they were doing. And then there is this Summer Afreeca who is still a bit volatile, like Emily mentioned. Like, they're just like trying to fit into this newfound aggression they just put on themselves, but they're performing super well, and they just defeated Kingdom Dragons, who were previously undefeated. And Emily, I know you have a lot to say about Afreeca Freecs, so what are your thoughts on?
I mean, I love them. They play like a mid-tier LPL team, or like a pretty strong LPL team, and by that I don't mean that as an insult. I actually think that their risk taking is very refreshing, especially in Korea, because if we're looking at previous playstyles, were typically based on being risk averse, or if you have a 50-50, right, you're not going to go for it. You're going to wait until it's a 60-40 in your favor, or like even a 70-30, 80-20. But Afreeca don't do that.
No.
They just kind of go for it.
Yeah.
And obviously people are going to highlight Dread because his performances have been obviously not flawless. I'm not making a jungler pun there, by the way, because there's jungler named Flawless. I just realized. They have not been like without mistakes, but I think his willingness to continue to push is one of the things that has really helped this Afreeca team. Obviously, Keen is kind of the same, right? Like, Keen was still remarkably strong even when Afreeca was struggling last split. I also think it's interesting that if you remember when Afreeca started kind of winning games or like taking games off of people, it was with what people considered their B lineup, and not which a lot of these players are kind of coming from, instead of like Dread playing over Spirit, that kind of thing. So I think the thing I like the most about Afreeca is just that they're a breath of fresh air, and they're willing to try things, even if those things maybe should not be tried and or are not the best decision at the time. I think it's something that Korean teams really need. Like, they need that team to kind of kick them in the butt, right? And more so than Griffin, who we've talked about, or I have historically harped on Griffin and received a lot of criticism for harping on Griffin for having not the greatest early game and not taking as many risks. I think the Afreeca Freecs are the kind of team that South Korea needs right now. Even if they they might not be the best team at the end of it.
Yeah.
They are the team that the region needs. You can make a like, they're the team that needs but don't deserve, or whatever. That's actually why, like, they're just so fun. Like, the Kingzone and Afreeca series was absolutely my favorite LCK match.
Oh my god!
Split thus far, it was so good. Like, it was so good. Fun.
It was so fun.
And you know, sometimes you're just throwing your hands up and being like, "What are they doing in draft? Why are they over there? Like, this is not the right move." But I think, again, like, that is what Korea needs. I think we have to, and I know it's in your notes, so I don't know if you want me to bring it up, or we can just segue into NoFe's presence, because I think him having a stronger hand on this team has been really good. I cited NoFe as one of the additions to the Freecs that I was really looking forward to last split, and we didn't really see that kind of payoff or his influence on the team as much until this split. And historically, I think one thing that NoFe has been really good at, going back to the Tigers and then also EDG, is finding a really good way for his players to play, or again, finding a way for and drafts for the team that he has. So you notice, even if they're similar picks, they're not playing like EDG, right? Like, they're not trying to get bot lane turned down at like 6 minutes or whatever, because EDG always does that. They're playing to how they want to play instead. And I think that's really good. And I also think it historically, and you can talk about this more just because I think you've talked to him personally. I think historically, you also saw this with the Tigers. NoFe has been willing to take more risks or step outside of what people know was the Korean play style, even when that play style was accepted as the best. He's still willing to take risks with the Tigers. And I think that is a really good pairing with some of these younger players. I also think that part of UCal's resurgence has been that they've been putting him on champions that he's super comfortable with. Obviously, the Taliyah has to be noted because he is a remarkably strong Taliyah player, and in his league debut. That's actually what KT put him on as well, to try to make him comfortable.
He was known as like a Talia streamer, I believe.
Yeah.
Yeah, before
so
he
I
became
think
pro.
that's another thing I wanted to point out. But I want you to talk about NoFe because I know you interviewed him.
Like before, to give a quick background on how young Afreeca Freecs is. Emily just mentioned that they're quite young. They are now the youngest roster in LCK at the moment. I believe their average age is 18 and a half.
18, yeah.
Yeah, and I think Keen is 19. I believe Keen is 19 or 20, depending on whether he had a birthday. But Keen is the oldest player in the starting roster. And that's just scary.
He just turned 20.
He just turned 20, okay. Did I miss Keen's birthday? Damn it.
At the end of May.
No, I missed his birthday. I should have said it. I should have said like a happy birthday, Keen tweet. Damn it. I feel bad. But Keen is the oldest player in that roster, and this is a bunch of players who, except for Keen, had never had an international appearance. They're young. They're all mechanically very gifted, and if a Korean team makes a team out of a bunch of young mechanical gifted players, what they do is, from what I see, like it depends on the coaches and the team, but I think Korean teams usually have a idea of what a team should be, what a top laner should do, what a mid laner should do, what a jungler should do, what an AD should do in this meta, etc., etc. And usually there'll be a period where they try to mold that younger player into a specific role that they see is fit given the meta. But I think what NoFe is doing, even though there might be a bit of that he'd also like, hey, what are you comfortable with? What do you want to play? Like, how do you want to flourish? And I recently had an interview with NoFe, and it's probably going out either tomorrow or the day after. NoFe actually mentioned that, hey, this has been my philosophy to enable he kind of implied that he was enabling the players more and also have this higher paced aggression, and this has been my philosophy since the old Rocks days, since the EDG days. And because my question was, where has this new playstyle been inspired from? And he simply said he wasn't being inspired by LPO or LEC in particular. He was just being inspired by himself, and he just kept his philosophy same. And another thing I noticed about Afreeca is even when they lose, they're still comfortable. Like, even when they just drop the series because of like Yuka literally inting with Talia ult and like because of obvious series of mistakes, when they go back into the coaching booth, the players mentioned that, hey, like, we tried our best, we have nothing to lose on the second game, so let's just try our best. Let's keep playing confidently. And they come back to the stage and they don't lose their aggression and they don't lose their belief in like, hey, even though this pick is not necessarily meta, we'll pick those champions. And I think because Afreeca has some very high ceiling players such as Dread, Yukao, Aiming, I always thought that he has like the skills to become a very good ADC player. Now NoFe is giving them the picks they're confident with. NoFe is giving them confidence boost between each games, and I just think it synergizes really well with the skills, like a skill. What do you call it? Like, what do you call it when there's like a potential on how far this character can grow?
Skill ceiling.
A skill ceiling, skill potential that Afreeca individual player has. I don't know. That's what I think is happening.
I also think like it's refreshing to see that kind of attitude towards younger players, because I think traditionally, as you said, a lot of coaches come in with a mindset of this is what a mid laner is supposed to do, this is what a jungler is supposed to do, this is what a top laner is supposed to do, this is what a bot laner is supposed to do, etc. And I think with the opening of the meta, not that you still can come in and like not know your matchups, right? And not that you as a mid laner can't come in and know that like you need to hold mid and you need to communicate with the jungler. Like there are always going to be certain things that you need to do for every role. But I think the opening up of the meta has lent itself to all of those things being more fluid. And so it's really nice to see NoFe paired with this young of a lineup, because these players are given a lot more freedom in terms of how they want to play, instead of someone saying, this is how it's always been played, and therefore this is how you two are going to learn how to play the game on stage. I think that kind of freedom is super valuable. And again, like it's kind of like the Tigers back in the day, right? Like they weren't, you didn't know it then, but they were the team that Korea needed in 2015, even though SKT ended up taking Worlds that year by like a pretty significant margin. The Tigers were the only team that could even take a game off of them. I
Meta
think
is different
that
now. In this meta, I see Old Rocks winning over SKT in this meta.
Yeah.
If you give exactly the same lineup and give them another best of 5, I think maybe. Wow, the things that could have been.
This is a weird hypothetical. I think that it's really cool to see that these players aren't being boxed in by a certain amount of expectations, which is something that happens a lot, especially when you see players move up to the, you know, like we were talking about prior to the cast, and I know we'll touch on this when we get to SKT, but there's a lot of pressure and a lot of expectations that come with being on a team like SKT, and I see them as a team where sometimes you get there and they're like, okay, this is how we've always played, and so this is how we're going to play. And Afreeca is completely devoid of that. So again, they're the team that like Korea needs right now to give everyone else a push.
UCA voice comm should pretty much give you a good indication of how Afreeca's handling itself right now. This is all fun for them. It's like they're singing, they're picking their favorite champions. Like UCA's like Talia ulting everywhere. That's like the vibe I'm getting from the Afreeca at the moment. But I feel like this is like a natural. Unless you have anything else to add on to Afreeca, I actually want to move on to Sandbox, because that's another team I'm respecting a lot because of the amount of freedom and respect for individual preferences of like individual player performances within the coaching staff. And I believe Sandbox Gaming is the other team that's doing that in LCK, and I feel like that's working out.
I really like, first of all, just randomly, I really like that Ghost has a team that's willing to allow him to thrive, because people might not know, because BDD was like the hyped player coming out of that CJ Scrim lineup during 2015 World. But Ghost was also one of the names that people were like, this kid's so good. Like, he's going to come in and he's going to smash. And then he had a bunch of really unfortunate teams and unfortunate performances. So it's really nice to see him finally like flourish, like spreading his wings. Yeah, like he's thriving. Yeah. It's very nice. Just because he was kind of one of those players that was promised to do really well and then got lost in the weird shuffle transition period of like 2015. So one thing I really like about Sandbox, even though, again, I've been pretty harsh on them in terms of their like mid to late game decision making during spring, is they, as we pointed out earlier, seem to know how they want to play regardless of draft with the players that they have. And even one thing I wanted to point out was they're picking up the Sona Tom Kench in game 2 against SKT. Obviously, Sivir Braum is a pretty good response, but it's not going to be one that is like insanely punishing unless Clid and Faker are down there a ton early because they're the Camille Elise duo. But with this lane, what I noticed is that on Fleek immediately went to pay attention bot side and like not necessarily babysit, but just make sure that they were not getting shoved in. So it showed me that even with some of these more scaling compositions that you're going to run, because Sandbox is not known as a team, as we said before, like even in spring, they had one of the strongest early games in Korea. Their mid game and late game was something I picked on them a lot for, but their early game was quite strong and quite aggressive, and I liked that about them. So picking this composition with like the Talia, Jace, and then the Sona, Tom Kench bot lane, it's obviously strong, but it's not necessarily that kind of scaling isn't necessarily something I think of when I think of Sandbox, but I thought their attention to how they wanted to play that was also really good. And it's something that a team like SKT could learn from.
I love how we're mentioning SKT every time we talk about Flexer.
I know. We're building up to it because they're the last team that we're going to go at. But I think that, like, just pointing that out, like, small things that On Fleek is doing, he's been known for being, like, you know, this aggressive early game jungler. And even though he wasn't, like, ganking and zipping all over the place, that attention to detail was really good. And it showed me that they're not going to abandon their attention to the early game, even if they are running these scaling comps.
Like, what I like about Sandbox, and this might be a result-based thing, you know, how something works out well, and then you say, oh, this draft worked out well, like, you know, they won because of this draft. So this might be a result-based observation, but Sandbox is doing well. And what I notice about Sandbox is the coaching staff give a lot of freedom and respect to the players. If the player wants to do something, they usually tend to like give it to them. And I also have been told by multiple players in their team that the organization is really amazing with, like, you know, catering to the needs of the players. Like, there just seems to be a lot of freedom within them. Like, you know, I asked Ghost, hey, like, you know, why are you guys focusing on objectives so much? And it was quite surprising because I kind of expected him to say, oh, because objectives are really important in the current meta, but he didn't say that. He's like, Onflick loves dragons. We even tease him, oh my god, are you in love with all the dragons? Because, like, you know, whenever Onflick sees dragons, he wants to go for them at all cost. So it's actually like Onflick's tendencies working into this, like, you know, team color of Sandbox, which I thought was quite funny how Ghost responded to that. Like, Onflick loves dragons, but they just seem to have melded, like, all the distinct players who have, like, their own way of playing the game and put them together. And Joker is being like a bit of a glue / sacrificial person whose characteristic is to play based on what his team needs. So I feel like Sandbox is actually a team created with the individual characteristic of the players, not watered down. Does it make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And again, I think it's something that, if teams, like, if a team with as much talent on it as SKT, for example, can figure out how to do that with their players, I think that Sandbox, or like Griffin, for example, who are a little shaky right now, if they can do that better, I think that Sandbox will drop off a bit just because their talent level isn't necessarily what I would I don't think it's necessarily like the best lineup, right? In terms of
skill ceiling,
raw mechanical skill.
Yeah.
But so I think you could see them drop off a bit in that regard. But again, I think that they are a team that Korea just like desperately needs to learn from with certain things that they're doing. The dragon thing is hilarious. Like, but something like that tells me, like the team itself is making decisions based on how they want to play rather than a set idea of this is how the game should be played.
Yeah. Like, again.
And I think finding a balance between, like, there are certain things that you're always going to have to do in League of Legends to win the game.
Of course.
But finding a balance between that and your team color is super important right now. And I think that is what so many teams in Korea are struggling with.
And that's going back to your initial point of, I agree with you in that, like, I don't think the G2 way of, like, extreme aggression isn't, like, the only way of succeeding. There are just multiple ways of succeeding right now, and G2 is just excelling on that because this is their playstyle. This is the playstyle they feel natural in, they're having fun with, so they have better execution with it. And they just happens to be the strongest team, well, I'm basing it off on MSI, strongest team in the world at the moment, so it seems like that is the best playstyle, but I wouldn't necessarily make that statement.
Yeah, and I mean, I think you can also look at, so not only who is succeeding in Korea right now, but also over in China, you have Fun plus Phoenix, who have a very set way of playing. However, it's flexible enough that they can play with it a lot. And obviously, it's kind of like the next evolution of what
play around
teams have done in the past.
It's like play around Doinby, but here's such a large champion pool that you can play around Doinby in multiple ways. Right? Yeah.
Or we're gonna flex Gimby in mid. But that in and of itself, like, that's telling me, you know, FPX isn't looking at other teams and being like, need to play this specific way. They're playing how they want to play and making what is available in the meta suit them. And so I think if you look at the teams that are succeeding across the board, that is happening with the top teams in every region. You see that with C9. And to some extent TSM in NA as well.
I like how I would it be too far if I draw some kind of comparison between management style and performance at the moment?
No.
Like you just mentioned C9.
Yeah, I don't think that's a bad comparison at all.
Some people might say I'm too extreme to try to draw the comparison, but I don't think it's a coincidence that specific teams with specific management style in Korea is performing more well than others. But speaking of interesting coaching style and like the organization, what the fuck is happening with Griffin, Emily? I'm actually a bit lost on them.
I mean, I think we're seeing a lot of their tendencies that we saw throughout even last year, but I think the most obvious like page to put your finger on is the spring finals, right? Where we saw a lot of Griffin's worst.
I know you can't see me, but I'm doing the whole nut like this at the moment. I know you can't see me.
So many of their worst tendencies turned back in on them, right? And it starts with the Talia Pantheon, not because it's terrible, because there's a tendency, like you said, to do results-based analysis where you're like, they picked this and they lost
so it was bad.
Shit, and this is terrible. I actually don't think that. I think if you have a team that is super aggressive, like you put that in the hands of, and I know they're on everyone's shit list right now and they're doing really badly, but you put that in the hands of like IG in LCK, like you put that in the hands of like current Afreeca, and they're gonna be diving your bot lane that entire time, right? They're just gonna be on your turret. They're gonna be diving past it. That's what this lane is supposed to do. And that's not what Griffin was able to do with it, because they have a slower playstyle early. Even with their more aggressive picks, they've played a bit slower than certain other teams would with those picks. And that's why I point to spring finals as kind of like a culmination of some of Griffin's worst habits, because they pick this super aggressive lane. They aren't able to execute it correctly, which is fine. They test it, you know, that's something you test out and you fail with it, and that's okay because it's just game one. But then they pick it again in game 3. And I can't say whether it specifically comes from CV Max, because again, I'm not doing results-based analysis where it's like, this was shit. It's like, your team does not execute this well enough to be able to play it. So I don't understand why they pick it again. And this is something that we saw from Griffin last year in playoffs.
Yeah, Lucian Funnel, I still remember this.
It's something that we've seen from them quite frequently. And it's just, they've gotten away with it because they've won when they've done that, when they've tunneled on certain picks in draft more often than they've lost until recently. So I think that they have the players in place to be able to make the most of this meta.
This is a team with the high ceiling.
Yeah, like Viper specifically, we know he can play so many different things at a really high level, and he is incredibly flexible. So I think you reevaluate what you want to do with this team and like what your strengths are, and then go from there. Because I think there are certain things that, for example, Sword and Chovy, they're never going to be like, to bring a comparison back to G2 again, right? Because everyone is comparing things to G2 just because they're the best team in the world right now. They're never going to be able to pull off that triple flex with Viper, right? Like, that's not their play style. That's why I actually didn't like when they put Chovy on Lissandra in finals.
Really?
Not because Chovy is like bad at Lissandra, and not because it's a bad pick, but because his play style is more of like a straight up laning play style where they focus on giving him advantages and he holds the mid lane rather than like roaming to affect side lanes. I think that you want to give them, like, you want to recognize what they're really good at. Like, I know people shit on Sword all the time and say that he is the weakest link on the team, but I think he is actually can be such a reliable in the top lane if you make the most of his play style rather than asking him to do, asking him to play like assassins or something like that, right? Like, I think there are so many ways that this team actually can play if you evaluate what the strengths and weaknesses of their players are. But I think right now they just seem stuck on how to do that. And I don't know if it's because like we've seen them get stuck before again, and they haven't been punished for it as much in the past. So I think now that you do see other teams opening up the way that they want to play, specifically the first three teams that we went through. Now that Griffin is faced with that, I hope that they can adapt and change, because they do have the talent available on this team to be the best team in Korea.
Like, so I'm gonna draw a comparison. So I want them to adapt and change, but I want them to do it from their own comfort zone, not from what CB Max believes to be the ideal style of playing. Because okay, I'm gonna draw two comparisons because two came to my mind. Number one, you know how you draw a lot, Emily? I know that you do now and then. You know how you try to draw something so perfect that everything you draw looks shit when someone else tells you, "Hey, you're just doing perfect. You're just drawing something well. Just complete the picture." But you're like, no, like, I have some ideal vision in my head, but what you end up with is no drawing at all, which might have been worse than some kind of drawing, which would actually have been decent. And I think that's one comparison I'll make to what Griffin is, like a conundrum Griffin is stuck in right now. And the second thing is like, like you look for this ideal girl, and like, you keep like this idea of, hey, this is like the perfect girl, and someone else tells you, hey, like, you got this person who's hitting on you and this person's hitting on you, they're pretty okay. And then as long as you try to make the relationship work and get to know that person better, like, it might actually work out. But you're like, oh no, I don't want to get to know that person better because this person is 1% of this ideal image of what the perfect girl was. And in the end, you end up being solo and lonely and
So you blame CB Max for this?
I'm not blaming CB Max because again, this is a result based. I'm not in the coaching booth. I don't know how much of their decision or their belief on what an ideal playstyle is from the individual players or the coaching staff. I'm not going to make that assumption. But however, from the interviews that I have done with the players, it just seems that they have this imagery of there being a perfect playstyle. Like, remember that interview that I did with CB Max for ESPN? And then, like, you know, this is like, he's just trying to achieve something perfect. But this meta means just go with something you're comfortable with. It doesn't have to be something that's perfect because there is no perfection at the moment. Just play with.
Well,
go for it.
If I'm looking at, like, I think a really good example of this is their obviously Hanwha Life we've talked about briefly, and they're not a great team, but like looking at like when they did bring out the Sona Tom Kench
against
the rest
Kingzone.
of the
Sona Tom Kench?
that was bad. But I'm talking about against Hanwha Life. Their comp is Ornn, Sedge, Yasuo, Sona, Tom Kench. I love this for them. This plays into all of this team's strengths, right? You have Chovy on this like incredible carry champion. Tarzan can control both the early and late game with the Sejuani. And you have the Ornn not only for the Yasuo knockup, but just because it's a really good tank that we know Sword can play well. So it like everything about this is perfect for this team. And I want to see more of that. If they're like, I want to see more of things that really suit them as players. I was gonna bring up something else about Griffin specifically, and now I like. Oh,
sorry.
You said that they're searching for a really specific play style. Griffin's strength previously has always been that they're on the same page, right? Their 5-as-1 attitude, where even if they fell behind early, they could out team fight you 5v5. And there was, at the time, like, it was them and possibly SKT, but primarily Griffin. They were the best 5v5 team fighting team in LCK. I think in that, I believe it was an interview with you, but I forget whether it was the CV Max interview or another interview that you did with one of their players. But they talked about how if there's a certain percentage of play, they'll all agree to not take that risk together or take that risk together. And so moving forward, I'd like to see them try to be a little bit less risk averse, because I do feel like, I wish I could remember the interview because I know you did it, but they actually lay out the numbers where they're like, it has to be like 80-20 for us, and then we all go, and then we're all in agreement.
I think I know, remember which one that is. Okay, 1 second. Oopsie, I did something bad. I will remember. I will tell you what interview that was after this video, because I'm not actually allowed to tell you. And when I tell you why, you will remember why. I'm actually,
okay, sorry.
Do you know what I'm talking about? Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well,
but,
anyway.
But I completely agree with you. And so even though, what the fuck? Sorry guys, I clicked something else. Even though Griffin has tried a multitude of playstyles and they have even been successful with some, I do see some common tendencies in them, and the first one is obviously all of them being in the same page, because everyone there except for Lehens, their first actual like league experience is in Griffin. I know that Tarzan had like a random excursion at like a 3rd-tier league in China, but that's something else. But
well,
so
Sword played in Turkey.
Pardon? Oh yeah, Sword is in Turkey, so 3 of them. Yeah. But like this is like the first team they all made careers out of, and they definitely seem to have this like a hype mind thing going on, and their team parts are still pretty amazing, even though weirdly enough they haven't been going towards the 5v5 team fights as much as of late. but we know that they're capable, so that's their first tendency. And the second tendency is, you mentioned risk averseness, and I think a lot of that is to do with Tarzan. Because I think Tarzan is like the pillar that the Griffin playstyle is built upon. Like, he controls so much of what they do, and he's extremely calculated. Like, I can see them from the way he talks. Like, he doesn't say a single sentence without thinking about it. Like, every move that he makes, every jungle path he makes, he thought about all the consequences. And I think that also impacts how other players play. And to a lesser extent, Viper, because I think he's an extremely good maze player, and he's really good at positioning himself, but he's not good at flashing in and, like, letting the luck play out, whether one auto attack's gonna, like, decide whether you or the other AD carry dies. Like, he's also another player that thinks about the consequences of his moves a lot. Like, so I think that is the characteristics of Griffin, and I do agree with you that they could be more risky around how they play, but in the end, I want them to play around their own characteristic, their own strengths. Like, Sword playing tanks is not necessarily a bad thing. Like, them going towards team fights is not necessarily their thing. Like, I just want them to perhaps experiment with different things, and at least with rivals, come up with a ground that they're comfortable with. Because what's perfect for them is what they're comfortable with. That is what I believe. Especially in this meta. Especially in this meta. This is not Ardent Sensor meta where the support has to build Ardent. This is not that kind of meta. Like, you can do what you believe is the best. And because they have such a high skill ceiling, what is best for them is probably good enough for them to make it to Worlds.
Yeah, especially since they're in such a good spot for it. Again, like we talk about, they would have to fall off really hard just because they have, 70 points already?
Yeah, I think so. They came second place.
Yeah. Yeah, they have 70 championship points. So their destiny is really in their own hands, kind of similar to last year. There's no team that can take away Griffin going to Worlds other than Griffin themselves.
Stop the weird stuff. Just do what's best for you, even if it means playing AD carry teamer. If you feel like this is the best thing for the day, just do it.
I want to see Lehen's support Elise.
Again? He played quite a few of them.
Yeah, why not?
Yeah.
Bring it out again. It might work.
I was actually gonna go with KT next, but I think we both itching to talk about SKT so much.
We don't even need to talk about KT. They're kind of whatever.
They're fifth place team in LCK right now. They are above SKT. They're above Sandbox Gaming.
The LCK.
Yeah. Like, the amazing thing about SKT is they're still obviously just trying to figure themselves out. They're trying to get their in-game communication correct. Like, it's really obvious in how they play, but it's just also that the roster is so busted, like, in a good way, that when they get some kind of semblance of teamwork going, that they are winning against middle tier teams. That's the thing about KT at the moment.
Yeah. Having a bot lane helps. I said having a bot lane helps.
Yeah. Do you think?
No, go.
Do you think KT is gonna get better from now? And then do you think KT is actually a playoffs materials now? Because they have a lot more. They have a lot more to catch up in compared to other teams who have largely kept their roster.
I think it's gonna take a lot. Like, and maybe this is just because I'm pretty open about being a KT fan, which means I am a lot harsher on them than I think a lot of other people would be. But I think I'm not confident that they'll be able to have enough synergy to make any sort of playoff run, and the fact that they have 0 championship points and are coming out of relegation is like, on the one hand, you can pretty much only go up from here, right? Outside of getting relegated.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, whether they're a playoff team or whether they're going to be able to make any sort of run at qualifying for Worlds, it's going to be incredibly difficult for them, because not only are they trying to figure out the same things a lot of other Korean teams are figuring out, but they're also trying to figure out their team synergy, which was a huge issue last split as well. And you also have other teams that, again, have spent more time together, that are more coordinated, that are looking stronger and have a better understanding of how they want to play. And KT, again, like, they have to figure out their synergy, and they have to figure out how they want to play in this meta.
It is.
So one is hard enough. Having to deal with the 2 at once, I'm not confident. I mean, they could surprise me, and you can come back and be like, Emily, you were wrong, because I'm wrong about a ton of things. But from where I stand now, it's going to be quite difficult for them.
Hey, you were right to worry about Griffin's early game. you were the prophet.
IG inting, so you know.
You were the prophet. You were the prophet in many ways. Okay, fuck. I want to talk about SKT so bad, so let's get straight into it.
Yeah, let's go. Fresh over
Okay,
KT.
what the fuck is SKT doing?
So Raz brought up last week, right? He's like, you know, if you look at everyone but G2, we're having issues across the board with MSI teams, because SKT struggle life right now. Team Liquid, I'm not super convinced, even with their wins this past week. I think they still have some issues that they need to work out. And then, but they're not like tanking, right? They're not performing as badly as I would say Invictus Gaming and SKT are in compared to expectations. IG, who knows? Some like they're really emotionally volatile by their own admission, right? And this is the first time that they've had to deal with like a really big stumbling block without having time, because previously it would always be they'd lose to RNG and they'd probably be really upset about it, but they had time because there would be a break. Here you have Battleland sitting out and then coming back. You have Rookie going home to visit his family for family reasons, which
I feel really bad.
Is just unfortunate timing. So we'll put them aside as well. SKT. So initially, when I saw that first Jin Air series, I had the same thought as Raz. I was like, you know, they have a bit of an MSI hangover. They're probably pretty burnt out, as, you know, talking to the TL guys, they have actually come out and said, like, yeah, you know, we needed a break. Like, we're kind of burnt out from the loss was really difficult because they got absolutely obliterated. SKT's loss was quite close. And I know, again, Raz went over a lot of this last week, but to come off that and then have the Jin Air series, which Jin Air should have won. I'm sorry. That first game was one of the most egregious throws I've seen in a really long time.
Unfortunately, I saw that coming because Jin Air is just like...
Because Jin Air always does it! Oh, God. So...
Like, that team has high mechanical ceiling. It's just that they have potential to become a mini Afreeca when I look at their fucking roster. It's just that they don't believe in their own shot calling. That is the biggest thing.
Yeah, it's unfortunate. So SKT won that barely, and I was like, okay, it's whatever. They're coming back. They're probably burnt out. And then they go on to lose to Afreeca, and then they lose to Kingzone. And these are 2-1s, and then they get 2-0'd by Sandbox. And by the time they're losing to Sandbox, they put effort in the second game.
Not a good sign, no.
That's actually, like, to me, that's like a really bad sign, because, like, is Mata tilted? Is Coma suddenly going to start swapping players again off of what we would consider the main roster, like what happened last year? So now I'm just like, there's something internally going on with the team where they're just not on the same page, or they're still burnt out, or what. But these early losses are definitely not great in a league where you have teams really starting to figure out how they want to play, like Kingzone, Afreeca, and Sandbox coming out to early leads. So SKT, I think another thing that we need to point out with them is that they historically have been the team to, I think, set the pace for South Korea because they were so successful, with the exception of Rock's Tigers, or the Tigers through multiple
iterations of sponsorship.
I think a lot of teams, because of their success, looked to SKT and tried to emulate their playstyle.
Yes, and I would draw that back to Samsung White, actually, because they're the team that first perfected the whole vision control rotation style, and other teams emulated and copied them, and it just turned out that SKT did it the best. But I will say that Samsung White was the beginning of it all. That's me.
I think the most frustrating thing that I touched upon it earlier, but they don't have to play this way.
No.
Like, this team is so talented, and you have a jungler in Clid who you know is willing to take very large risks for very large rewards. And I'm not saying that should be SKT's new default playstyle because they have to be aggressive early and that's the only way to play. But I'm saying you do not have to play this slow scaling, we cede advantages until we don't style. You have Mata, who was incredibly aggressive when he was on KT. Like, KT had a very strong early game last year. You have Clid. I know Faker can be aggressive. I've seen it in the past.
Yeah.
And I also know Teddy can be really strong at trading in lane because he would sometimes be a really aggressive laner when he was on Jin as well.
Yeah.
And then you have Khan, who, again, is known for taking a lot of trades in top and playing very forward. And one of the criticisms of him was actually that he would play too aggressively or be too far forward. It's just something that can be fixed if you have like a ton of jungle pressure or a ton of mid pressure, right? So I think my huge issue with SKT is that you look at this lineup and you're like, you have the flexibility with these players on paper. From what we've seen from these players in the past, you have the flexibility to have a team where you can be really flexible with your draft, where you can pick a variety of different things for multiple roles. And they just don't. And yeah, like that to me is the most frustrating thing about SKT, because that tells me it's coming from like an organizational perspective.
I'll give you a very interesting observation. Prior to the Sandbox thing, the Sandbox series, SKT had like almost 0% win rate on red side. And that tells me that their drafting is quite rigid, that it can be easily read. And also, we almost never see flex picks in SKT, definitely not. Like, when I see a draft, I look at it and say, this is like a draft from SKT. And so they have like very rigid. I said this on Raz's stream and I stand by this, I'll say it again. They have very specific idea about what a top laner should do, what a mid laner should do, where the jungler should activate it, how they should transition from early game to mid game. They have very specific checkpoints, and they walk through it slowly one by one. And I think to a lesser degree, Griffin does that, which also frustrates me. But and that idea of checkpoints seem to constrain the players in a way. Ooh, I said it. Now I'm scared.
Yeah, I mean,
I agree. This is such a high caliber roster. They shouldn't be performing like this.
No, that's probably the most frustrating. That's the most frustrating part about it. Like, it's just so weird because we've seen each of these players except Faker, and we've seen this from him while he's been on SKT. We've seen him be more aggressive. These players on different teams have been more aggressive, less risk adverse, more flexible, and they haven't shown it on this lineup.
It just
yeah, it really feels like they're just trying to go back and play the way that they think the game should be played. And the weird thing is that sometimes they don't even necessarily draft like that. Like, returning to the Sandbox Game 2, you have Camille Elise as your mid jungle. You can use that to punish the Sona Tom Kench. You can use that to have really strong forward vision.
Alice is such a good counter to Sona because she's like, I'm gonna dive your tower like 5 times before level 6.
Yeah.
Kind of champion.
and like, it's weird because you see this push and pull with Clid where he came over from JDG. I actually wasn't super, like, I wasn't as high on him other people were, because I think sometimes he tended to cede too many advantages early with some of his riskier invades on JDG. But when he first came to the team, you saw that he would do these super aggressive dives on like Lee Sin, right? And the rest of the team would just kind of be like, okay, you're on your own. like, like, we're not going that far. And I just don't want to see him forced into a role that I've seen a lot of SKT junglers forced into. I know this is something I've spoken about in the past with Blank and also with Peanut. I think SKT has a very set idea of what they want their jungler to do. And I think when they sign players like Clid, they're like, this person is going to help kick us in the butt and move away from that. But what inevitably ends up happening is that person kind of gets like sucked back into the idea of what SKT should be.
Yeah.
And it's tough. Like, prior to going live, you and I were talking about expectations that come with being on the SKT, right? Like, there are certain pressures that are really only exist with this team because they've been Korea's team for so long. I don't know if that plays a part in it. I don't know how much coaching plays a part in it. I don't know how much Faker, who is now the only constant, plays a part in it. But there's something about this team that makes them go back to this one very specific style of play. And it's weird when you can see them trying in draft to like push away from it, but then the way that they execute it on the Rift is not the way you need to execute that kind of comp. It's just really weird because you can see the struggle, I guess.
I like weird comparison. I like weird metaphors, and I'm gonna add one of them. It feels like a jazz musician trying to play classical. Maybe that's not like exact. Like that doesn't make sense.
No, I get it.
Yeah. Like even if it's like a good musician and you can play another style, but it just feels like they're trying to serve like the old way of doing this. Like even though this is a completely new roster and all, like they have different pros and cons, ups and downs. Teddy is a different AD carry from Bang. Khan is definitely a different like top laner from. Oh my god, he is a way different top laner from Talo and Tara. Let's be honest.
Yeah, or even like going back further, like Duke.
Yeah, Duke, Marin. No, Khan is a different breed, but
like, no, he's a bit like Marin, but and shoving up too much and getting punished. But yeah,
like I'll say Khan is slightly more aggressive, like, but I just feel like there could have been a different way for SKT to play, and that SKT could have had the time to experiment with that playstyle and build up the trust between the players within that playstyle, and it just hasn't happened. I'm just thinking that there was an alternative reality where SKT actually figured out a playstyle that more different types of playstyle that suits them better and practiced on it, so the players have built more trust within their playstyle. I just think there was an alternative reality that could have happened.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, hopefully they'll figure it out, because like it would be so sad to see this lineup not do well.
That's gonna break LCK in a lot of ways. It's just that Faker and as an individual and SKT as an org commands so much prestige and to a lesser extent views that even though I have to stay neutral as a journalist, like I know that it will cause a certain damage to like as an SKT as an LCK as an organization to not have SKT represented at all at Worlds. That's me. And it'll be sad.
No, I mean you kind of feel the same way about like RNG in China.
Exactly.
As we brought up that comparison prior to this as well.
Yeah.
Because SKT has done so much for Korea, just generally, and it's always really sad to see them. Like it was sad to see them struggle last year and miss the World Championship as well. So there's like no excuse of this lineup. Fortunately, they are in the best position of all statistically because they did make MSI. And another thing to remember is that they did play closely to G2. It's not like they were completely stomped or they had some sort of, aneurysm and before the match happens, like IG. The most damning thing right now about SKT is that they just seem pretty lost. And the effort sub, I was just like, oof, oh no, like no, like not again, like don't do it. Please don't start swapping out players at random, because I do think that the Khan, Clid, Faker, Teddy Mata lineup is so good and is proven to be very good. And I really want to see them stick with that roster and try to figure things out.
I was kind of shocked that when they subbed Clid out, when even the Haru played
with heart. Yeah.
even though Haru played this series perfectly well, I think Clid has actually been the key player in SKT's recent few games. So I was a bit shocked. Like it almost felt like, you know, when your computer's not working and you kick it, even though this is not the good solution at all. Like it almost kind of felt that way a little bit. Like, you know, don't do that.
That is the best metaphor you've had. It's like, no, but like who was making SKT stand out at MSI? It was Clid. Like he was their MVP. He was the one that was pushing them to apply early pressure and to be proactive. And even if you're playing a scaling comp, because I think people correlate aggression with being proactive, which isn't the same thing. You can have a scaling composition and still be proactive about your vision and where you're applying pressure. Like proactivity doesn't necessarily mean you're ganking every single lane. You're doing this like insane level 1, level 2 gank on Jarvan or whatever. You don't have to do that as long as you're applying pressure and you're exerting some sort of control over your early game. And that's what Clid brought to SKT at MSI, in my opinion. Exactly. Even though, yes, he also did do like the Jarvan level 2 gank, if I remember correctly. I'm pretty sure I was tweeting like, yes, Clid, do the China gank.
The China gank. The Ning special.
Yeah. The China gank.
MLXG.
But I think that is something the SKT needs, and I think that's something that Clid brings to this team. So yes, I also did not like when they brought Haru in, even though he's like perfectly serviceable, and actually that was his role on Samsung, if you remember correctly, where Ambition would be the more like slow scaling, methodical kind of pathing jungler, and Haru would be the more aggressive, invade heavy jungler. But yeah, I think Clid is essential to kicking this team into gear, and so I would like to see him continue to start.
The only acceptable subs that I see at the moment is Flame and Nuguri, and to a next extent, Punch and Canyon, because those are the players that have their own very distinctive, like, you know, advantages and disadvantages. Like Flame has more experience and more map awareness. Nuguri tunnel visions into the top lane, but God, he's so good at laning phase. So they have
his mechanics are insane.
Oh my God, his lane phase is so good. But like, so that I can see where it's justifiable them subbing in and subbing out depending on the matchup. But at this point, at Summer Split, you should be getting more comfortable with your roster, getting more robust with your starting roster, not experimenting new things out of scratch. And for them to sub in Effort, who has not started before, during the entirety of spring, made me worry a bit.
Yeah, that tells, like, the only conclusion I can draw from that is that Motto was just like super tilted. But that's also me like making assumptions, so it could not be true.
Mata didn't play that game before that. Well, let's be honest there. He missed a lot of skill shots and stuff.
The Rakan.
Yeah.
I think I just want them to stick with the lineup and try to work out their issues. Yeah. That's it. Like it would be so sad to see this roster fail. It'd be really sad.
Just stick with the starting roster, slightly experiment with like different win conditions, like not force it. Just see what your players are more comfortable with and try different synergies, like, you know, top carry, mid lane carry, bot carry. And then because you have that time to experiment a little bit, because you have the most circuit points, just get to a point where you're comfortable enough in the playoffs. That's what I think SKT should do. That's me.
Yeah. I mean, they're in a good position statistically, so it's like not time to worry yet about like, are SKT gonna make worlds? Which is always like the Reddit meme.
The meme's back.
Yeah. But I think they need to figure it out in the next like few series. Who do they have coming up actually? Who do they play this week?
Okay. Before Rift Rivals.
They play they're Damwon and
Damwon and who?
Damwon, which they can beat. And
Damwon's also trying to figure themselves out.
Yeah. Griffin on Saturday, so that'll be
Griffin versus SKT?
Yeah.
Oh.
That'll be interesting.
That'll be interesting. Okay, like, I think we've gone through all the major topics of the LCK coming into week 2. Like, what would your summary of the situation be? Because I do have my own summary. Because now, like, LCK fans are desperate because they want the teams to start doing well before Rift Rivals, which means, which is a big deal for Korea right now because we haven't won a single international tournament for the last 48 months, possibly, and Korea just wants to win over LPL, and the representatives are SKT, Griffin, Kingzone, yay, and Sandbox Gaming.
Oh no! Yeah. Well.
Well.
Who were our? Let's see.
LPL, IG, OnePlus,
yeah.
Top Gaming, and JDG. So maybe it's not too terrible. JD is doing something and IG is doing something.
Yeah, JDG and IG I can't really get a good handle on. IG has the potential to come back, but it depends on whether Rookie's back, whether Balin's starting, what's going on internally with them. Which, again, like, to reiterate, like, it always has been like this. I think this is just and they are very self-aware of this. This is just the first kind of big hurdle that they've had. FPX and TOP are the two that you're going to have to really worry about. And I also think that it's funny because I joked about this in chat last week, but like Chinese teams really did not coordinate as much until 2017 Rift Rivals, and there's like a very funny picture of like all of the coaches huddling under a street lamp at like 2 a.m. and then being like, what if we worked together? And like anyway, so I think that we're lucky that RNG, if you're rooting for LCK, you're lucky that RNG aren't going. But TOP and FPX are going to be quite difficult for a lot of these teams to deal with because they are proactive, and in the case of TOP, they're very good at fighting you. I mean, in the case of FPX as well, but
depends on the game, depends on the pick for them.
Yeah. So my summary for the LCK right now.
If you could give one advice that all the coaches and players could hear.
look at what Kingzone and Afreeca are doing and Sandbox are doing. But don't take it as rigidly as we need to draft this or we need to do this exactly, because I think it's the nebulous stuff that Kingzone, Afreeca, and Sandbox are doing for their players, right? It's how they're treating their players and letting their players have freedom in the way that they want to play as a unit and both individually and what they feel comfortable on. And that is actually what has made G2 successful. So if you're looking at G2 as the example, because I feel like South Koreans have always automatically looked at, and to some extent all of League of Legends has always looked at what they consider to be the best team and the best region at the time and be like, we're going to take exactly what they're doing because it's the best way to play the game and make it for us. And that's not the lesson you can take right now. The lesson that you can take is find the best way to play with your players within the meta parameters that are given to you. And I think that is what has made G2 so successful, in addition to the fact that their roster is just like so stinking talented. But like, who's to say that like SKT, who has an insane amount of talent on their lineup, if they could have that kind of attitude towards the game, I want to see that. You know, like, I'm not saying you need to look at Afreeca and be like, we need to do exactly what Afreeca are doing, because they make a ton of mistakes.
Start singing in game.
Yeah, like please don't. but at the same time, that spirit, that attitude towards the way to play the game, because there's so many options open to teams right now. That's what I want teams like SKT to take away.
Because in the beginning of the stream, I posed the question: is the early game, like aggression, the right way to play? And my answer to that is not necessarily, because I think Korea, because that is what a lot of the Korean communities are leaning towards. Like, okay, G2 is like the way of playing to aspire to, and I do not agree with that. And Korea is falling back to the whole trap of there is one best way of playing, and there is one best team in the world, and that is whoever won the recent international tournament. They're falling into that trap again, and that is not the case. And like you said, this is the meta where you can explore, and because there are so many different parts, it is the one you should be most comfortable with. And I'm gonna go back to the whole speech that Yamato Cannon did at 2018 Worlds: play your own fucking game. For Afreeca Freecs, because of the nature of their roster, they're having fun, they're making mistakes as they are trying to find their footworks out, but even when they are still, have some rough edges, it's working out for them. So play your own game. Like, this is still earlier enough in the summer split that you can experiment to a certain extent and like shift around where you're sitting and find a position that you're most comfortable with. So find it, because when it gets to World, it's going to be a long ride.
Yeah, and that's why I'm not too concerned yet about, I'll say I'm not too concerned yet about Griffin.
Concerned about
will
they fix drafting the same thing again? Okay, sorry.
You know what I mean? Like, SKT's history gives me cause for concern because of the way that they've historically shaped their teams. But in terms of Griffin, I mean, they're still 3-1, right? Like, they're not doing badly. I think there's also this weird thing that happens when a team that previously just destroyed everyone at the top, right? It's like they set KDA records and like all this other insane stuff last split. And they're not doing that anymore because there are other teams coming up and challenging them, but I don't think that's the bad thing, provided that they learn from it and they have time. And they still have a strong record. So I'm not as concerned about Griffin, to be quite honest. I think they'll probably be okay.
It's good that Kingzone and Afreeca and Sandbox are the teams that are doing well, because, like you said, good influence.
Yeah.
Maybe I'm biased, but there you go.
I mean, I also want, I want Korea to do well.
Yes.
I mean, I guess more specifically, I want KT to do well, but that's out the window. So, but I mean, I don't have like a super regional bias. I just always want to see teams perform at their best, which again is why SKT is so frustrating to me.
That is why. Like, this, if you look at individual players, they should be doing, like, they did take G2 to a very close game. Like,
yeah,
if they made a few less mistakes, we'll be celebrating how good SKT was at MSI, because they had just won MSI. That's like an alternative reality that's just there. But I agree with you. I'm a bit worried about SKT, probably a bit more than Griffin. I'm just worried about some of their foundational beliefs, such as finding the perfect game and drafting the fucking same thing twice in a row, because they have this whole mindset, oh, there is a perfect way to draft. We just made a mistake. We just didn't execute that well. It's okay. We'll live. I think that's a good summary and a nice tie up to the stream. What do you reckon, Emily? Is there anything else you want to add?
No, that's it. I felt like I repeated myself a lot, so I'm sorry if I did.
Me too. I got frustrated a few times. Because like you, I want LCK to do well. And I see a lot of potential in LCK, and I just want them to perform in their full potential, because in the end, I will have the regional bias for LCK. But we'll see. And that's it. And Emily, will you be coming for Rift Rivals? Have that been decided yet?
I don't think so, because actually, so I was going to go to Korea for Rift Rivals just as like a vacation thing. But a bunch of my friends are going to be in town that week, as stupid as this sounds, for Anime Expo. And although I am not going, I'm not going to go to Anime Expo. Because I probably won't have time. These are people that I like never get to see and live all around the country. So yeah, I won't be going. But I know you're going to be here in LA for Rift Rivals.
I randomly booked the ticket. So I will be there for Rift Rivals, and I'll get to see you. And after that, I'll come back to Korea to witness either the redemption arc or the fall of LCK.
I think it's funny that of all tournaments, China like kicked their own butts in gear for Rift Rivals specifically. Like, that's when it started, right? Like that's when the LPL's kind of like ascension started.
It was really the MSI. It was really the MSI 2018 when RNG
that's true too.
Yeah. Okay, cool.
I think RNG are hopefully going to be good, but we'll see.
We'll see. Okay, thank you so much for joining.
Thank you.
And I was gonna have an ending, but I forgot about it. And
tell me your ending. Like,
play
end the YouTube. They're like, I had an ending and I forgot about it.